She came to Wyoming with a suitcase, a name on a letter, and no idea if the man who wrote it was kind or cruel. Only that staying behind would have been its own kind of death. A woman alone. A widower drowning in grief. Two children who'd already lost everything once, and a town that had already decided she wouldn't last the winter. This is the story of Evelyn Mercer. Not a fairy tale, not a romance, but a reckoning. With loneliness, with belonging, and with what it truly costs to build a life from nothing in the most unforgiving land in America. If this story moves you, leave a like and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this has traveled. The train announced itself before it was ever seen. A low, grinding rumble rolled across the Wyoming plain like thunder that didn't know when to stop. And the people of Dry Creek heard it the way they heard most things, without much enthusiasm. A few men stepped out from the general store to watch the iron engine crawl in from the eastern track. A woman on the porch of the dry goods shop shaded her eyes with one hand. Children who'd been chasing a dog between the buildings stopped what they were doing, not because the train was remarkable, but because a stopped train meant someone was getting off, and someone getting off in Dry Creek was always worth noting. It was September. The air had that particular quality of early Wyoming fall, clear and sharp, edged with something cold that hadn't fully committed yet. The grass along the ridge had gone from green to a dull silvered gold, and the sky above was enormous and pale and indifferent to everything beneath it. Evelyn Mercer stepped down from the train car with one hand gripping the iron rail and one hand pressed flat against her traveling coat to keep the wind from embarrassing her. She was 31 years old, unremarkable in appearance in the way that women who work too hard for too long tend to become. Brown hair pinned up and already coming loose, a face that would have been called handsome if anyone had been looking for that word, hands that were not soft. She carried a single bag. It was not a small bag, but it was not a large one either. Everything she owned was in it, and that fact did not make her feel light. It made her feel like a woman who had packed carefully because she was not sure she would be staying. She stood at the edge of the platform and looked at Dry Creek, Wyoming. It was not much to look at. A main street of maybe 8 buildings, most of them in various stages of weathered defeat. A livery stable at the far end with a roof that sagged on one side like a man with a bad shoulder. A saloon that appeared to be trying to look respectable and not quite managing it. A small church that someone had painted white, though the paint was flaking. Between the buildings, the land opened up in every direction into something vast and largely empty, interrupted only by the dark line of hills to the northwest and the occasional dark shape of a cottonwood tree along what she assumed was a creek bed. This was what she had said yes to. She had said yes by letter, which was a particular kind of madness she'd had months to think about. The advertisement had appeared in a Chicago newspaper in March. Widower, rancher, Wyoming territory. 2 children. Seeking capable woman for honest partnership. No illusions offered. Honest correspondence only. She had read it 3 times, which was 2 times more than she'd needed to understand it, and 1 time more than she'd needed to decide that the man who wrote it was probably telling the truth, because no one lying about his intentions would write no illusions offered and mean it. She had written back. He had written back. This had gone on for 4 months. Letters traveling the 1,200 miles between Chicago and Wyoming in a way that felt almost civilized compared to the thing she was doing now, which was standing on a train platform in a town she'd never seen, looking for a man she'd never met. His name was Silas Rowan. She saw him before he saw her, which she suspected would not often be the case once they were living in the same house. He was standing at the far end of the platform with his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim in slow circles the way men did when they were nervous but didn't want anyone to know. He was taller than she'd expected. The letters hadn't covered that, with dark hair that was going gray at the temples, and a face that had been outdoors for a long time. Not unpleasant, not warm, exactly. Careful, she decided. He looked like a man who had learned to be careful. He spotted her a moment later and stopped turning his hat. She walked toward him. He walked toward her. They met somewhere in the middle of the platform in a way that would have looked to anyone watching like 2 people who had agreed to meet but weren't sure what to do about it now that they had. "Miss Mercer," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. "Mr. Rowan." She extended her hand and he shook it, which was not what most men would have done in that situation. She noted that. "You made it," he said. "I did." He looked at her bag. Is that everything? Yes. He nodded as if she'd confirmed something he'd been thinking about. Train was late. 40 minutes. There was trouble with the engine outside Cheyenne. I heard. He reached for her bag and she let him take it, not because she couldn't carry it herself, but because the gesture seemed important to him in some way that had nothing to do with her capability. My wagon's out front. The children are at the neighbors. They walked off the platform together, and she was aware of the people watching from the street. Not rudely, or not entirely rudely, but watching nonetheless. The way people watch in small towns where newcomers are rare, and therefore interesting, and therefore subject to immediate collective evaluation. She kept her head up and her pace steady, and told herself that she had survived 1,200 miles of train travel and 4 months of uncertainty, and that whatever these people thought of her was not her problem yet. The wagon was a working vehicle, not dressed up for the occasion. That told her something she appreciated. The Rowan Ranch was 7 miles outside of town, down a road that was only approximately a road, more of a direction someone had agreed to repeatedly travel until the grass gave up. The wagon seat was hard, and the wind had committed to cold by the time they left town behind. Evelyn sat with her hands in her lap and watched the land open up around her in a way that was either terrifying or magnificent, and she was not yet sure which. Silas drove without talking much. This was consistent with his letters, which had been direct and informative but not verbose. She'd asked him once, in the third letter, to describe the ranch honestly. He had written back, "It is not what I hoped it would be by now. But it is not nothing either. I believe it could be more with the right partnership. I will not pretend otherwise." She had found this reassuring in a way that a more romantic description would not have been. "The children," she said, after a while. "How did you explain it to them?" He was quiet for a moment. "I told them the truth, that I'd been writing to a woman in Chicago who might come out and help us." "How did they take it?" "Clara was angry." He said it plainly, without apology. "She's 12. She thinks it's a betrayal of her mother." "And the boy?" "Thomas is 8. He mostly wanted to know if you could cook." A pause. "I told him I didn't know." Evelyn almost smiled. "I can cook. Not elaborately, but adequately." "That'll do." She looked out at the land. "What about Clara? The anger?" "I won't sugarcoat it," he said. "She's a good girl, but she's hurting, and when she's hurting, she uses it like a weapon sometimes. I'm not asking you to fix that. I'm not sure it can be fixed from the outside." "I'm not planning to fix anything," Evelyn said. "I'm planning to show up. There's a difference." He glanced at her sideways. She had the sense he was recalibrating something. "There is," he agreed. The ranch appeared first as a dark shape against the pale sweep of the plain, then resolved into specifics as they drew closer. A main house, a barn, 2 smaller outbuildings, a fence line that went on for some distance and had seen better days in at least 2 places she could count from this distance. There was a kitchen garden to the south side of the house, harvested and turned under for the fall, and a chicken coop that listed slightly to the east. A single dog came out to meet the wagon, an old brown hound with a gray muzzle, who regarded her without hostility but without enthusiasm either. "That's Biscuit," Silas said. "Appropriate name," she said, and climbed down from the wagon before he could come around to help her, which she could see him starting to do. He didn't comment on that. She appreciated that too. The house was 2 rooms and a loft. It was clean, cleaner than she'd expected from a man alone with 2 children and a working ranch, which told her either he was naturally tidy or he'd made an effort for her arrival. She suspected the latter but kept the thought to herself. He showed her the bedroom that would be hers, small, 1 window facing north, a quilt on the bed that had been made by someone who knew how to sew, and a small braided rug on the floor. She touched the bedpost with 1 finger, testing the realness of it. "It's not much," Silas said from the doorway. "It's a room," she said. "I've slept in worse." "All right." He shifted his weight. "I'll go get the children. Supper. I put a stew on this morning before I left. It should be ready." He was gone before she could respond, and she stood alone in the small room with her bag at her feet and the pale September light coming through the north window, and she allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of something that was not quite fear and not quite grief, a kind of reckoning with the decision she'd made. And then she unpacked her bag. Clara Rowan was, as her father had said, angry. She came through the front door with the controlled fury of a child who had decided to be polite about it, which was its own kind of war. She was tall for 12, with her father's dark coloring and eyes that missed nothing and gave back less. She shook Evelyn's hand when Silas indicated she should, and said, "Nice to meet you, Miss Mercer," in a tone that communicated the precise opposite. Thomas was a different creature entirely. He was small for 8, gap-toothed, with a smear of something that might have been mud along his left ear, and he walked up to Evelyn with the unguarded directness of a child who hadn't yet learned to be suspicious of his own curiosity. "Pa says you came on a train," he said. "I did." "How far?" "About 1,200 miles. His eyes went wide. "That's real far." "It is." "Did you see buffalo?" "A few, through the window outside of Laramie." He considered this with the gravity of someone receiving important geographical intelligence. "Pa says we used to have more buffalo, but they're mostly gone now." He squinted at her. "Can you ride a horse?" "Thomas?" Silas said. "It's a fair question," Evelyn said. She looked at Thomas. "A little, not well. I'm hoping to learn." Thomas appeared to find this acceptable. Clara, who had been standing near the wall with her arms folded, said nothing. They ate supper. The stew was decent, not inspired, but honest, and the conversation was careful in the way that first conversations in loaded situations tend to be. Silas asked about her journey. Thomas asked about Chicago, which he had clearly been imagining as a place of almost mythological density. Clara ate and watched and said nothing that wasn't required. Afterward, Evelyn helped clear the table without being asked, which caused Silas to pause and then resume what he was doing as if he hadn't paused. Clara washed the dishes and Evelyn dried them, and for a while the only sound was water and the clank of crockery and wind against the kitchen window. Clara handed her a pot, and she dried it and put it on the shelf where Clara pointed. "You don't have to do this," Clara said, not looking at her. "We've been managing fine." "I know," Evelyn said. "I'm not doing it because you can't manage. I'm doing it because it needs doing." Clara didn't respond, but the angle of her shoulders shifted, almost imperceptibly, and Evelyn filed that away. Well, the first week was an education in the particular texture of hard work. Evelyn had grown up in difficult circumstances. Her father a laborer in the Pennsylvania coal fields, her mother dead before Evelyn was 10, and enough years of scraping and managing behind her to have developed a practical relationship with physical discomfort. But ranch work was a different vocabulary entirely, and she was a slow student at first, which she found humiliating in a private way she didn't let show. The chickens she could manage. The kitchen garden, turned under for winter but already needing plans laid for spring, she could manage. Cooking for 4 people 3 times a day, in a kitchen with a temperamental wood stove and limited provisions, she could manage that. What she could not manage at first was the land itself, the scale of it. The way the work never ended? Not really, not even at the end of a day, because the next day's work was already accumulating before the current day finished. She watched Silas work. He moved through the ranch with the efficient, unhurried competence of a man who had done every task so many times that his body knew the movements without consulting the rest of him. He was up before first light and rarely stopped before dark, and he did it all without complaint and without drama, which she found both admirable and slightly exhausting to witness. On the 3rd day, she asked him to show her how to mend a fence section. He looked at her with the same sideways, recalibrating expression he'd worn in the wagon. "You sure?" he said. "No," she said. "Show me anyway." He showed her. Her hands were clumsy with the wire, and she cut the inside of her palm on the 2nd strand, and she didn't say anything about it until he noticed the blood, and she admitted it, and he wrapped it with a strip of cloth from his pocket with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man accustomed to minor wounds. "You don't have to do this," he said, almost exactly what Clara had said, she noted, which suggested it was a family pattern. "I know," she said. "Same answer I gave your daughter." He looked at her. "What answer was that?" "That I'm doing it because it needs doing, not because I have to prove something." She paused. "Well, maybe a little because I have to prove something, but mostly the first reason." He didn't smile exactly, but something around his eyes changed. "Fair enough," he said, and handed her the wire tool again. Metz. The town's verdict on Evelyn Mercer came back to her through the reliable telegraph of small community gossip, filtered through the neighbor woman who brought over a preserved apple pie at the end of the first week. Her name was Ruth Hadley, 50s, stout, with the direct manner of a woman who had lived too long on the frontier to bother with indirection. She set the pie on the kitchen table and sat down without being asked and looked at Evelyn with frankly appraising eyes. "People in town are talking," she said. "I assumed they would be," Evelyn said. She poured coffee. "Some of them think you won't last the winter." "What do you think?" Ruth considered her. "I think you've got calloused hands for a city woman, and you didn't flinch when the dog knocked the milk pail over this morning." "I was startled," Evelyn said. "I just didn't show it." "That's the same thing out here," Ruth said, and accepted the coffee. "What'd they tell you about Silas before you came?" "Nothing. I only knew what he wrote." Ruth nodded slowly. "He's a good man, hard to read. His wife, Margaret, she was sick for almost a year before she died. He didn't ask for help, even when he needed it badly. That's both his best quality and his worst one." "I've gathered that." Clara was devoted to her mother. Still is, I suppose. Ruth turned her coffee cup in a slow circle. "She's going to make it hard on you." "She already is," Evelyn said. "That's her right." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "All right," she said finally, in a tone that suggested she was adding something to a ledger she kept privately. "I'll say what I came to say. Silas Rowan is not a man who asks for things easily. The fact that he put that advertisement in the paper at all, that cost him something. I don't know what you're expecting from this arrangement, but whatever it is, I'd ask you to take that into account." "I expect to work," Evelyn said. "I expect it to be difficult. I expect the children will resent me for a while, and that's not unjust. I expect—" She paused, looking for the honest word. "I expect nothing that I haven't already been prepared to be wrong about." Ruth Hadley studied her for another moment, then picked up her coffee and drank it. "Well," she said, "that might be the most sensible thing I've heard a woman say in this county in 2 years." The incident with the cattle happened on the 9th day. Silas had gone out before dawn to check the north pasture fence, leaving Evelyn in the kitchen with the children. Clara was in the loft. Thomas was at the table working on a school lesson he didn't appear to be enjoying. The sound of the cattle came before the understanding of it. A low, rolling disturbance. Nothing she would have recognized 2 weeks earlier, but that her body now associated with something wrong. She went to the window and saw them, a dozen head moving along the wrong side of the fence line, which meant a section had given way somewhere, and they were drifting south toward the creek bed and the broken ground beyond it. She didn't hesitate. She went to the barn, saddled the mare that Silas had been letting her practice on, taking longer at it than he would have, her hands still learning the buckles, and rode out to turn the cattle. She was a bad rider. She knew this about herself with clarity, but she was a persistent bad rider, which counted for something, and she'd watched Silas work cattle enough in 9 days to understand the basic logic of it. Get around them, pressure from the outside, move them in the direction you wanted by being in the direction you didn't want them to go. She managed. It was ugly, and it took longer than it should have, and at one point the mare spooked sideways and she nearly came off. But she caught herself and kept going, and by the time Silas came back from the north pasture an hour later, she had the cattle back inside the fence line and had identified the break, a 50-foot section where 2 posts had heaved up in the soft ground. She was standing as the break when he rode up. Her hair had come entirely out of its pins. The right knee of her skirt was muddy from where she'd gone down when the mare spooked. She had scratches on her left forearm from the wire she'd been using to temporarily hold the section together. Silas looked at the cattle. He looked at the fence. He looked at her. "You moved them," he said. "They were heading for the creek bed." "You could have gotten hurt." "I didn't." He dismounted and looked at the temporary repair she'd made on the fence, kneeling to examine the heaved post with his hands. He didn't say anything for a while. "Posts frosted out," he said finally. "Both of them. I'll need to reset them. I can help. You've had a long morning. So have you." He looked up at her from where he was crouching, and there was something in his face that hadn't been there before. Not warmth, exactly, not yet, but something that was the raw material of it. Consideration. Recognition. "All right," he said, "hand me that tool." She handed it to him, and they worked for the next 2 hours resetting the posts and restringing the wire, and the conversation between them was mostly functional, Hold this, try the left side, pass me that. But there was a quality to it that was different from the careful, measured interactions of the first week. The quality of two people who had discovered they could work together in a difficulty without either of them making it worse. On the way back to the house, she noticed Clara standing on the porch. The girl had come out, presumably to watch. She couldn't read the expression on Clara's face from this distance, but she hadn't gone back inside. That night, after the children were in bed, Silas sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and didn't say anything for a long time. Evelyn was at the table too, writing a letter to an old friend in Chicago, which felt strange, the letter writing, when the life she was writing about was so new it still had the texture of something provisional. "You wrote, in your second letter," Silas said, "that you'd lived in Chicago for 8 years after you left Pennsylvania." "That's right. What were you doing there?" She set down her pen. "Sewing work first, then bookkeeping for a dry goods merchant on State Street. He was a decent employer, for what that's worth." "Why did you leave?" She considered how to answer this. The honest answer had several layers, and she was not certain yet how many of them she wanted to unfold in a kitchen in Wyoming. But something about the day, the cattle, the fence, the way he'd said all right and meant it, made her feel that imprecision would be a step backward. "The merchant retired and sold the business," she said. "The new owner was not a decent employer, and I was 31 years old, and I had a room in a boarding house and a ledger book and nothing else, and I decided that if I was going to be building something from the ground up, I wanted it to be something real." She picked up her pen again. "Land is real. A house is real. Children are real." A pause. "I'm aware that sounds perhaps overly practical." "No," Silas said. He was quiet for a moment. "It sounds like someone who knows what they want." "I know what I want," she agreed. "I'm just not certain yet if I know how to have it." He drank his coffee. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved along the side of the house, looking for gaps. "My wife," he said, and stopped. Started again. "Margaret knew this land like she was born to it, which she was, pretty near. I always thought if something happened to me, she'd keep this place running better than I ever did." A long pause. "It went the other way." Evelyn said nothing. She understood that this was a man saying something he didn't say often, and that the correct response was to let it land without cushioning it. "I didn't know what to do with the children's grief," he said. "I still don't most days. Clara, she's been holding on to it like she's afraid if she stops being angry, she'll lose her mother again. Thomas doesn't really understand what happened. He knows something's wrong, but he can't quite put a name to it." He set down his cup. "I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for us." "I know you're not," she said. "I'm telling you because you deserve to know what you're in the middle of." She looked at him steadily. "I know what I'm in the middle of, Mr. Rowan. I've been in the middle of it since the wagon left town." He was quiet again. The wind ran along the house. Biscuit shifted and sighed somewhere near the door. "Silas," he said. She looked up. "You can call me Silas." She considered this. "All right," she said. "Silas?" He nodded, picked up his cup, found it empty, and stood. "Good night, then." "Good night." After he was gone, she finished her letter. It was longer than she'd meant it to be. When she sealed it and put it aside, she sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen with the lamp burning low and the wind outside and the particular dark of the Wyoming plain pressing against the window. She was tired. Her arm hurt where the wire had scratched it. Her knee ached from the fall on the mare. She was also, she realized, and the realization was strange enough to sit with for a moment, not sorry. Not sorry she'd come. Not sorry about any of it. Not tonight. She turned down the lamp and went to bed. The letter she'd written that night made it to Chicago in 11 days. She knew because her friend wrote back, and the reply arrived on a Tuesday in October when the first real cold had come down off the mountains and settled into the valley like it intended to stay. Evelyn read it at the kitchen table while the stew simmered, and Thomas did his schoolwork nearby, and Clara, who had taken to watching her with the assessing patience of a border collie deciding whether a new animal was a threat, sat in the corner mending a shirt she'd already mended twice. Her friend's letter was warm and a little alarmed. "Are you all right? Is he kind? Are the children terrible? Write back immediately and tell me everything honestly." Evelyn folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket and thought about what honestly would look like, put into words. She was all right. He was not unkind. The children were complicated. The work was relentless. She was learning things about herself she hadn't expected, most of them inconvenient. What she did not put in the reply when she wrote it that evening was any of that. She wrote, "I am well. The land is extraordinary and terrifying. I believe I am doing the right thing. I will write more when I know more." She sealed it and set it by the door for the next trip to town and went back to work. October moved through the ranch like it had a schedule to keep. The cattle needed to be moved to the lower pasture before the first hard freeze locked the upper ground. The barn roof had a section that Silas had been intending to repair since summer and now had to be done before snow. The root cellar needed restocking, the firewood needed stacking, the harnesses needed mending, and the north fence needed 2 more posts reset where the ground had heaved the same way it had in September. Evelyn did not watch this work from the house. She had made a decision, sometime in the middle of that first week, that she was not going to position herself as a domestic figure waiting to be useful inside while the real work happened outside. It was not a decision she announced. She simply began showing up. She was at the barn before Silas most mornings, not because she needed to prove anything, but because the alternatives, sitting in the house waiting for something to require her, felt like a slower kind of dying than whatever was happening out there in the cold. Silas had stopped expressing surprise about this. He'd adapted to her presence the way the ranch adapted to weather, by incorporating it into the working order of things without making a production of it. He showed her what she needed to know when she needed to know it, and when she made mistakes, which was often, and sometimes expensively, he corrected them once and moved on. The roof was where she nearly quit. Not the ranch, not the arrangement, not Wyoming, just the roof specifically. It was a 15-foot climb up the side of the barn, on a ladder that had a slightly alarming quality of flex at the top 2 rungs, and the wind up there was a different animal than the wind at ground level. It was personal. It pushed at her from the side and then changed its mind and pushed from the front, and the shingles she was supposed to be nailing down kept trying to slide out of her grip. "You can hold from below," Silas said. He was 6 feet away on the same roof, driving nails with a speed and accuracy that she found mildly irritating. "I'm not going below," she said, through teeth clenched around a nail. "You've never done this before. And I'll have done it once when we're finished." He drove 3 more nails without responding. Then, "Angle the nail to the left when the shingle's wet. It'll set cleaner." She tried it. He was right. Which she didn't say out loud, but which she suspected he understood. They finished the roof in a day and a half. Her shoulders ached for the better part of a week afterward, and she never said a word about it, and she noticed that Silas rotated his right shoulder in a particular way when he thought no one was watching, which told her his shoulders ached too. The move to the lower pasture was a 2-day operation, and it was the first time she rode alongside Silas as an actual working participant rather than a student observer. They brought the cattle down through the narrow draw between the east ridge and the creek bed, a route that required constant attention because the cattle were not interested in going where anyone wanted them to go and expressed this preference loudly and with their whole bodies. Evelyn had improved on horseback, not dramatically, but measurably, in the honest way that things improve when you do them every day out of necessity rather than inclination. She could manage the mare in most conditions now, including the mare's occasional opinion that a particular rock or shadow required emergency avoidance maneuvers. The second afternoon of the drive, 3 steers broke left up a scrubby hillside that had no business being climbed by a horse or a cow, and Silas went right to hold the rest of the herd while she went left after the breakaways, because that was where she happened to be positioned and because there wasn't time to discuss it. She got them back. It took 20 minutes of hard riding on ground she couldn't fully see, and at one point the mare went chest-deep into a sandy wash that neither of them had spotted until they were in it, and Evelyn's heart did something violent in her chest that she filed away to deal with later. But she got the 3 steers back onto the trail, and when she returned to find Silas holding the herd with a patience that probably cost him more than it looked like, she was out of breath, and her coat was covered in sand, and the mare was blowing hard. "I went into a wash," she said. "I saw." He looked at the mare, checking her legs. "She okay?" "Fine, scared both of us." He straightened up from the mare's foreleg. He looked at Evelyn in that way he had, direct, without excess interpretation. "That was good riding," he said. She was aware that this was not a small thing, coming from him, so she received it as it was offered and said only, I had a good teacher. He made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh and moved back to the herd. She followed. It was Ruth Hadley who told her what people in town were saying, because Ruth appeared to have appointed herself the channel through which information both traveled to and from the ranch, a role she performed with the professional directness of a telegraph operator who didn't editorialize but also didn't pretend the messages weren't interesting. She came by on a Thursday in late October with a bag of dried beans and the settled expression of someone delivering a mixed report. "Agnes Whitmore thinks you'll be gone by spring," she said, over coffee that had become an established routine. She said, and I'm quoting because the exact words seem relevant, that mail-order women always leave when they realize the difference between what they imagined and what's real. Evelyn drank her coffee. "What do you think?" "I think Agnes Whitmore has opinions about everyone and has been wrong about most of them." Ruth set down her cup. "Fletcher says you rode with Silas during the cattle move." Fletcher was the Hadleys' hired hand, a thin and observant man in his 50s who seemed to see everything that happened within a 5-mile radius. "We did," Evelyn said. "He said you went into a sand wash after 3 steers and came out with all 3. The mare came out with all 3. I was mostly holding on." "That's not what Fletcher said." Evelyn looked at the window. The light was the flat gray-white of a sky considering snow. "What would it take," she said, "for the people in town to stop waiting for me to leave?" Ruth considered this genuinely, which was one of the things Evelyn respected about her. She didn't dismiss the question or offer false comfort. "Time," Ruth said, "and something they can point to. Out here, people trust what they can see. Silas is trusted because he's worked this land for 11 years and never walked away from a bad season. You're new. New means uncertain." She paused. "It's not personal." "I know it's not personal," Evelyn said. "That doesn't make it less wearing." "No," Ruth agreed, "it doesn't." They sat with that for a moment, which was the kind of conversation Evelyn was discovering you could only have with women who'd lived long enough on the frontier to have stopped pretending it was easier than it was. The incident that shifted something, not everything, not at once, but something, happened on a Wednesday in the first week of November. Silas had gone to town for supplies and was expected back by midday. By 2 o'clock he hadn't returned, and the sky to the northwest had begun doing something that Evelyn did not like the look of. She had grown up with Pennsylvania winters, which were serious, but the Wyoming version of a winter storm was a different proposition entirely. She had been told this, and she had seen evidence of it in the way everyone, Silas, Ruth, even Thomas, talked about weather with a respect that was not given to other subjects. By 3 o'clock, the wind had gone from present to purposeful, and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees since noon, which she knew because she'd been watching the thermometer nailed to the barn door with the attentiveness of someone who understood that a number on a thermometer in this place was not an academic observation. She made a decision. "Clara," she said. The girl was in the house, ostensibly doing her lessons, actually staring at the window with the same expression Evelyn was trying not to wear. "I need you to stay inside with Thomas. Bar the door after me and don't open it unless it's your father or me." Clara looked at her. "Where are you going?" "The livestock need to be in." "I can help. I know you can. I need you in here with Thomas." Something moved across Clara's face. The beginning of an argument and then the calculation that overrode it. She was 12 and old enough to understand that a situation was serious without having to be told twice. "Fine," she said, with the clipped economy of someone saving the disagreement for later. Evelyn went out. Getting the cattle in from the near pasture in deteriorating weather with no one to help her was not elegant. The wind was coming sideways by the time she reached the pasture gate, and the cattle were already unhappy. They felt weather in their bodies before it fully arrived, and their unhappiness made them uncooperative. She worked them in with the methodical persistence she'd been developing over 2 months, getting around them, pushing from behind, blocking the directions she didn't want them to go. It took 40 minutes, and by the time the last one was in the barn, the light was nearly gone, and the snow had started, not the gentle variety. She was latching the barn door when Silas's wagon came up the track, moving faster than it should have in those conditions. He pulled up, saw her standing at the barn, and was off the wagon bench before it had fully stopped. "The livestock," he started. "They're in," she said. "All of them. Come inside." He stood for a moment in the blowing snow, reading the barn, reading her, doing some kind of fast accounting. All of them, he said. All of them. Your supplies are getting wet. He turned and grabbed the supplies from the wagon bed with the focused speed of a man operating on instinct, and she held the barn door for the horse while he unhitched, and they worked in the close cold dark of the barn together without talking, because there was nothing that needed saying that the work wasn't already saying. Inside the house, Thomas had gone serious in the way small children go serious when they understand that something real is happening. Claire had put water on and was standing at the stove with the controlled stillness of someone who'd decided to be useful because it was better than being afraid. She looked at Evelyn when they came in, a long look that moved from Evelyn's face to the snow on her coat to the barn direction outside the window, and then she turned back to the stove. "I'll make tea," she said. She didn't say anything else. She didn't have to. That night, with the storm pressing hard against the house and the fire built up, and the children in the loft, Silas sat across the table from Evelyn with the particular settled quality of a man who has been running on tension for hours and has finally stopped. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "The livestock, I know. He stopped, tried again. You went out alone in that. Most people would have waited." "I don't know how to wait well," she said. "It's not one of my skills." "I'm gathering that." He turned his coffee cup. "How'd you know what to do with the cattle?" "I watched you, and I've done it enough now that my body knows more than my head does." He nodded slowly. "That's when you know you've learned something, when your body knows it." They sat for a while in the near quiet of the storm. Outside, the wind found every imperfection in the house's construction and spoke through it. "The people in town," she said. "They think I won't stay." "I know what they think." "Does it bother you?" He considered this with the same seriousness he brought to everything, which she'd come to recognize as one of his most fundamental qualities, the refusal to give an imprecise answer to a precise question. "It did at first," he said. "When I put that advertisement in the paper, I had people tell me to my face it was a waste of time, that women from the East don't last out here, that I'd be better off managing alone." He paused. "I started to think maybe they were right. And now?" He looked at her directly. "Now I think they don't know what they're talking about." She held his gaze for a moment, then looked away at the fire, because the directness of it caught her somewhere she hadn't been expecting. "I don't intend to leave," she said, to the fire rather than to him. "I want to be clear about that. Not because of obligation, because this is—" She pressed her lips together. "Because I think this is mine, this place. That might be presumptuous." "No," he said quietly. "It's not." The storm worked at the house all night. In the morning it had passed, and the world was white and still, and the sun came up over the ridge in a way that made the snow look like something that had been planned. Evelyn stood on the porch in her coat with her coffee and watched it, and she heard the door open behind her and Thomas's voice saying something about biscuits, and she thought about the letter in her pocket from Chicago and the woman who had asked if she was all right. She was more than all right. She was just not sure yet what to call it. November deepened and the cold with it, and the rhythm of the ranch adjusted to winter the way it adjusted to everything. Not gracefully, but practically. The days shortened. The work didn't. There was firewood to split, and she split it. There were harnesses to oil and mend in the evenings by lamplight, and she learned to do that too, her fingers eventually finding the particular logic of the stitching. There was schoolwork to help Thomas with, which she did not find difficult. She'd taught herself bookkeeping from a manual and retained a reasonable competence with arithmetic. And there were the long, cold evenings when the four of them were in the house together and had to figure out how to occupy the same space without obligation, making it feel like a performance. It was Thomas who found the middle ground first, because he was 8 and did not overthink things. He had discovered that Evelyn knew card games. She'd learned them at a boarding house where the evenings were long and entertainment was limited, and he leveraged this discovery with the focused enthusiasm of a child who has found an adult with an unexpected and useful skill. Within a week, the kitchen table after supper had become a regular card game, rotating between games she taught him and games he invented on the spot with rules that evolved conveniently in his favor. Silas played on the evenings when the day's work hadn't entirely hollowed him out. He was a careful player, which she found consistent with everything else about him. Clara did not play for the first 2 weeks. She sat nearby with her mending or her book, present but not participating, which was, Evelyn was learning to recognize, the closest Clara came to a concession. The girl was not absent. She was watching. On the 15th evening, Thomas made a rule error that Evelyn called gently, and Thomas appealed to Clara with the tactical instinct of a child who understands when reinforcement might be available. "Clara, tell her that's how you play it." Clara looked up from her book. "That's not how you play it," she told her brother, with the flat authority of an older sibling who is also correct. "You're making it up again." Thomas looked outraged. "I'm not making it up." "You always make it up." "Clara," Evelyn said, "would you like to play to make sure he doesn't make it up?" A pause. The pause that preceded, Evelyn had learned, either a refusal or a conditional acceptance. Clara set down her book. "Fine," she said, "but I'm not on his team." She was, it turned out, a considerably better card player than either Thomas or Silas, and she did not make a point of this except through the quality of her playing, which was itself the point. Evelyn watched the girl across the table, the way she held her cards close, the slight tightening of her expression when she had a good hand, the way she looked, briefly, not like a 12-year-old carrying grief, but just like a child playing a game and winning at it. Evelyn said nothing about this. She just shuffled for the next hand. The request came from Clara on a Sunday, and it cost the girl something to make it, which Evelyn understood from the set of her jaw when she appeared in the kitchen doorway. "My mother's quilt," Clara said, "the one on your bed. There's a seam coming loose on the border. Pa doesn't know how to fix it right." Evelyn put down the dish she was drying. "Would you like me to look at it?" A pause. Yes. They went to Evelyn's room, which still felt like something she was borrowing, if she was honest, and Clara pointed to the seam along the bottom border of the quilt where the stitching had pulled. Evelyn examined it. The work was fine, patient work, the kind of stitching that had been done by someone who cared about the permanence of what she was making. "It's a clean pull," Evelyn said. "Easy to repair without disturbing the rest." "My mother made it," Clara said. Not as information, as a statement that contained several other things inside it. "I can see that," Evelyn said. "The work is very careful." Clara sat on the edge of the bed, not her bed, Evelyn's bed, which had been her mother's room, and looked at the quilt. Her face was doing the complicated thing it did when she was somewhere between her anger and whatever was underneath it. "I don't hate you," Clara said to the quilt. "I want to make that clear. I know I'm not easy." Evelyn sat down beside her, not too close. "You don't have to be easy," she said. "I'm not asking for easy." "What are you asking for?" Evelyn thought about it honestly. "A chance," she said. "Not to replace anything. Not to make you forget what was here before me. Just a chance to be something that's mine to be. I'm not sure what that is yet. I think we're both figuring that out." Clara was quiet for a long time. Then, "She would have liked you," she said. "My mother. She was practical. She didn't have much patience for people who pretended things were easier than they were." She looked up. "She would have liked you," she said again, as if the repetition confirmed it. Evelyn did not trust herself to speak immediately. She looked at the quilt instead. "Thank you," she said, when she could say it steadily. Clara stood. "Can you fix it today?" "Yes." "Okay." She moved to the door, then stopped. "Evelyn?" The name direct for the first time. "You didn't have to go out in that storm last month for the cattle. Pa wouldn't have blamed you." "I know," Evelyn said. "Why did you?" She thought about it. "Because they were my responsibility," she said. "Because this is my place to take care of. I know not everyone agrees with that yet, but I've decided it's true." Clara looked at her for a moment with those dark, careful eyes that were so much her father's. "Okay," she said, and left. Evelyn sat alone on the edge of the bed with the quilt in her lap for a moment, then threaded her needle and got to work. December came in behind a wind that meant it. The days were short and hard, and the cold was the kind that found you even inside, and the ranch in winter revealed new work that summer had kept hidden. The constant vigilance over the water supply where pipes could freeze, the twice-daily checks on the livestock, the management of firewood that turned out to require considerably more wood than Evelyn had estimated and which produced the first genuine disagreement she and Silas had about the running of things. I'm saying we should have cut more in October, she said. She said it at the kitchen table directly because she had found that he responded better to directness than to approaches. I know we should have, he said. I ran out of time. We ran out of time. I was here in October. He looked at her. You were learning the cattle work. I could have been doing both. A pause. You're right, he said, which surprised her less than it would have surprised her in September. Next fall, we plan it differently. Next fall. She noticed the phrasing and stored it in the same place she stored other things she didn't want to examine too closely. The wood shortage meant a trip to the Hadley property to purchase what they needed to get through the rest of winter, and she went with Silas, and Fletcher Hadley helped them load the wagon with the economical help of a man who worked outdoors for a living and understood the social value of useful action over conversation. On the way back, on the road between the Hadley place and Dry Creek, they passed a small group of men outside the feed store. She recognized two of them, a rancher named Cole Merchant, who had looked through her at the one social gathering she'd attended in October, and a younger man she didn't know. She heard Cole Merchant say something as they passed, and she didn't catch all of it, but she caught, "Wonder how long before she heads back east." Not loud enough to be certain she was meant to hear it, loud enough that she could. Silas had heard it too. She knew from the set of his jaw. "Don't," she said quietly. He glanced at her. "Don't do anything about it," she said. "The best answer is not an argument. The best answer is still being here in a year." He was quiet for a moment. "You're probably right." "I'm definitely right." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the machinery of one. They drove home into the winter afternoon, the loaded wagon heavy with wood, the road hard under the wheels, and the plain around them white and enormous and indifferent to everyone's opinion about what belonged in it. She did not look back at the men outside the feed store. She kept her eyes on the road ahead, the outline of the mountains beyond it, and the particular quality of late December light that turned the snow along the ridgeline the color of old silver. She was still here. That was the answer, and she intended to keep giving it. January in Wyoming was not a month. It was a condition. It settled over the ranch like something that had no intention of leaving, and the days inside it had a compressed interior quality. The world reduced to the distance between the house and the barn and back again, the light arriving late and leaving early, the cold a permanent presence that you stopped noticing. The same way you stopped noticing a sound that never went away. Evelyn had thought she understood winter. She had been wrong about that, which was a pattern she was becoming accustomed to. What she had not been wrong about was her capacity to endure it. She discovered this about herself in the flat, unglamorous way that people discover things when there's no alternative and no audience, simply by continuing, day after day, to do what needed doing. The morning fire, the livestock checks, the cooking and the mending and the bookkeeping she had quietly taken over from Silas, who tracked the ranch's finances in a ledger that had the particular character of a document maintained by a man who understood numbers but resented them. She'd found it in the desk drawer in early December and asked, carefully, if he would mind her taking a look. He had said he wouldn't mind. Then he had watched her face while she read it, with the expression of a man who already knew what she was going to find. "You're operating at a loss," she said. Not an accusation, a fact. "I know. Last year and the year before." "I know that too." She had put the ledger on the table between them, and they had sat with it like a third party in the conversation, which in some sense it was. The ranch was not failing, not yet, not quite, but it was moving in the wrong direction, and had been moving that way for 2 years, which was how long Margaret Rowan had been gone, which was not a coincidence, but was also not the whole explanation. "The calving rate last spring was low," she said, 12% below what you projected. Bad spring. Late freeze came after the cows had started. And the hay yield in summer. Dry. Driest July in a decade, Fletcher said. "All right." She pulled the ledger toward her. "Then the question is what's in our control and what isn't. The hay situation we can partially address with better irrigation on the south field, which—" She stopped. "I'm getting ahead of myself." "No," Silas said. "Keep going." She had kept going, and over the next 3 weeks, at the kitchen table in the evenings, they had worked through it together. The costs that could be trimmed, the investments that needed to be made, the gap between where the ranch was and where it needed to be before another bad season could do real damage. Silas knew the land and the cattle better than she would for years. She knew numbers and planning in a way he'd never claimed to. It was the most practically useful conversation she'd had in years, and she was aware somewhere in the back of her mind that the ease of it, the way they moved through disagreements and reached conclusions without either of them needing to win, was not something you could plan for or manufacture. It was just there, between them, a working quality they had built without either of them naming it. She had not examined this too closely. Not yet. That changed in January. It was a letter that started it, which was appropriate given that a letter had started all of this. The letter came from a man named Gerald Hoyt, who identified himself as the representative of a land acquisition company operating out of Denver. It was addressed to Silas Rowan, and it was written in the careful, pleasant language of a man who had been taught to make unpleasant things sound like opportunities. The substance of it, once you stripped away the pleasantness, was an offer to purchase the Rowan Ranch, land and structures, at a price that was below its actual value, and was presented as generous through the power of comparison to nothing, since no other offer existed. Silas read it twice, set it on the table, and looked at Evelyn. "You read it," he said. "I saw the return address," she said. "I didn't read it." He pushed it across to her. She read it. "What does he mean by favorable terms for relocation?" she said. "He means he'll give you enough to start over somewhere else. And if you don't want to start somewhere else, then it's not favorable." He leaned back in his chair. "This isn't the first one. I've had 2 of these letters in the past 3 years. Different names, same company, I think." She looked at the letter again. Something in the language of it was familiar in a way she couldn't immediately place. The particular rhythm of it, the way it circled around the word value without ever committing to a definition. "Hoyt," she said. "Is that name known around here?" "Not to me." "Is there anyone in town who might know?" He thought about it. "Judge Parrish might. He's been here since before I came." She folded the letter and set it on the table. "We should ask him." Silas looked at her. "We," he said, not a correction, almost a question. "Unless you'd rather not," she said carefully. "No." He picked up his coffee. "We," he agreed. Judge Parrish was 71 years old and had the quality of a man who had outlasted most of his assumptions about the world, which had left him with a specific kind of patience. He received them in his sitting room in town on a Thursday, with the unhurried manner of someone who had nowhere else to be, and understood that this was itself a form of power. He read the letter once, slowly. "Meridian Land," he said. The name was not on the letter. The company in the letter was called Western Frontier Holdings. But the judge said it with the certainty of a man identifying something he'd seen in a different coat before. "You know them," Silas said. "I know of them. Different names, but the same principles, near as I can tell. They've been buying up valley land for 3 years. He set the letter on his knee. "You're not the first rancher to get one of these. The Calloway place sold out 18 months ago. The Finch family the spring before that." "They sold willingly?" Evelyn asked. "Willingly enough, after a difficult season and a letter that arrived at the right moment." The judge looked at her over his reading glasses. "You're the woman who came out from Chicago." "I am." He assessed her with the brief, complete attention of a man who had evaluated a great many people in his professional life. "Silas," he said, "what's your water situation?" "Fair. I've got rights on the East Creek going back to my original filing." "Those rights documented?" "In the county records." The judge nodded slowly. "Water is what they want, I believe. Not just land. There are parties in Denver, and I say parties because they are careful not to be any one named thing, who are interested in controlling valley water access. Land acquisition is the mechanism." He paused. "This is not something I can prove, but it is something I believe." Evelyn said, "What happens to ranchers who don't sell?" "So far, nothing overt. The ones who've sold have sold because a bad season took the will out of them, not because anyone forced them." He picked up the letter again. "But there are only so many bad seasons a man can have before you start asking what's natural and what's being encouraged." The drive home was quieter than the drive in. The road was hard-packed snow, the sky a uniform white-gray, and the horses moved through it with the steady indifference of animals for whom weather was weather. "He's saying someone might be interfering with ranches that don't sell," Evelyn said. He's suggesting it, Silas said. Where? Carefully. Is that the kind of thing that happens here? Out here? He looked at the road ahead. There's a lot of land and not many people watching it, so yes, it happens. She thought about the bad calving spring, the dry summer, the fence posts that had heaved more than they should have in two different sections. She thought about these things with the careful, provisional attention of a woman who knew the difference between a pattern and a coincidence, but also knew that seeing patterns that weren't there was its own kind of danger. I think we should keep records, she said. Everything that happens on the ranch. Dates, details. If something goes wrong, I want it written down. He was quiet for a moment. You think it'll come to something? I don't know, but I want to be the person who wrote things down if it does. He nodded slowly. All right. She took the ledger that night and started a second section in the back, dated from that day forward. Nothing dramatic, just facts and dates and observations, the way she'd kept books, the way you recorded things, not because you knew they mattered yet, but because the act of recording was itself a kind of preparation. February came, and with it the question that had been accumulating since October, like water behind a dam that was still holding but showing the pressure. It came, in the end, from Ruth Hadley, because Ruth was constitutionally incapable of leaving important things unsaid when she could see that everyone involved was carefully not saying them. She arrived on a Tuesday with no pie this time, which Evelyn took as a signal. Ruth sat down, accepted coffee, and said without preamble, "Your arrangement with Silas. It ends in spring, technically." Evelyn set down her cup. Technically. He wrote that letter offering a trial arrangement through the first winter, to see if it suited both parties. I know what the letter said. And spring is coming. Ruth looked at her directly. What are you going to do? The honest answer was that she had been living inside this question for weeks, circling it the way you circle something in the dark that you can't quite identify. She knew what she wanted. She'd known it since sometime in November, in the incremental, undeniable way that things become clear, not through revelation, but through accumulation. Through enough days of the right kind of difficulty, enough evenings at the kitchen table, enough mornings where the first thought in her mind was not about herself but about this place and these people and what needed doing. What she was less certain about was what she was afraid of. And she was afraid of something. She could feel the shape of it without fully articulating it. I'm going to stay, she said. If he wants me to stay. Ruth absorbed this. And if he asks you to stay as something more than a working arrangement? Evelyn looked at the window. The February light was thin and pale, and the snow outside was old snow, gray at the edges, waiting for the season to change. That, she said, is a different question. Is it? Yes. She paused. I know what I want. I'm not sure I trust it yet. Ruth looked at her with the particular expression she reserved for situations that required honest assessment rather than comfort. What are you afraid of? Choosing something real, Evelyn said, and then losing it. Again. The word again sat between them. Ruth didn't ask about it, which was the right choice. The other thing I'm afraid of, Evelyn said, is choosing it part way. Staying but holding something back. Using caution as a substitute for courage. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. I've spent a lot of my life being careful. I'm not certain careful has ever gotten me anything I actually wanted. Ruth Hadley was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Silas Rowan has not said the word love in this county since his wife died. I want you to know that so you understand what it would mean if he does. Evelyn looked at her. I'm not telling you what to decide, Ruth said. I'm telling you what the weight of the thing is. She was in the barn on a Thursday afternoon when the decision resolved itself. Not in a moment of dramatic clarity, but in the ordinary, unglamorous way that decisions resolve when you've been circling them long enough. She was mending a broken bridle, the leather stiff with cold, working by the light of the barn lantern, when Silas came in from the east pasture with that particular quality of cold-tired that meant he'd been out longer than he'd intended. He took off his gloves and breathed on his hands and didn't seem to notice she was there for a moment, and she watched him the way she'd watched him many times, the way he moved, the specific economy of it, the way he bore difficulty not as a burden he wanted acknowledged, but simply as the material the day was made of. She thought about what Ruth had said, about the weight of things. She thought about the woman who had stepped off the train in September with one bag and no certainty, and what that woman had believed at that moment was the best she could hope for. "Silas," she said. He turned, saw her with the bridle. "You don't have to do that." "I know." She set the bridle down. "I want to talk to you about something." He came and sat on the hay bale opposite her with the patience of a man who understood that this was not a conversation about bridles. He waited. "The arrangement," she said. "The original one. It ends in spring." "I know. I don't want it to end in spring." He held very still. "I want to stay," she said. "Not as an arrangement, not as something provisional. I want to stay because this is mine, this place, this work, these children. And because," she stopped, found the honest words. "Because I stopped thinking about whether I was making the right decision about 4 months ago and started thinking about whether I was doing the right work, and I think there's something important in that difference." Silas looked at her for a long time. The barn was cold, and the lantern threw uncertain light, and outside the wind moved through the Wyoming dusk in its indifferent, permanent way. "I need to tell you something," he said. "That I've been—" He stopped. He was not, as she had learned, a man who rushed toward words he wasn't ready to mean. "When Margaret died, I thought the thing I was supposed to do was hold this place together. For the children. That was the purpose. That was all it needed to be." He looked at his hands. "Then you came. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, I started to understand that what I'd thought was holding together was actually just holding still. Not the same thing." She waited. "I don't want the arrangement to end in spring either," he said. "I want you to stay." A pause. "As my wife. If that's something you'd want." She was quiet for a moment, not because she was uncertain, because some things deserve a moment of silence before you say yes to them. "Yes," she said, "that is something I'd want." He exhaled, a long, slow breath that had the quality of something released rather than expressed. He reached across the distance between them and took her hand, not dramatically, not with the gestures of courtship that had never been what this was about. Just her hand in his, in the cold, in a barn in Wyoming, and it was enough. It was more than enough. "Ibanja kommt." Clara took it harder than Evelyn had prepared for, which was her own failure of preparation, she acknowledged privately. She had known it would not be simple. She had thought she understood how not simple it would be. She had underestimated it. Clara did not make a scene. That was not her character. What she did was go quiet in a way that was different from her ordinary reserve. A withdrawal, careful and complete, like something buttoned shut. She did her work. She answered direct questions. She ate at the table and went to bed and got up the next morning and started again, and the absence of everything else was its own communication. Evelyn let 3 days pass. Then she went to the loft. Clara was sitting on her bed with a small box on her lap. A keepsake box Evelyn could see, with the quality of something private and chosen. She looked up when Evelyn appeared at the top of the loft stairs. "You didn't ask me," Clara said, flat, direct. "No," Evelyn said. "I didn't." "You should have asked me." Evelyn came and sat on the edge of the bed, leaving space between them. "You're right that I should have talked to you before it was decided. That was wrong, and I'm sorry." Clara looked down at the box in her lap. "She's not replaceable." "No, she's not. Everyone says, people always say things like, she would have wanted your father to be happy. She would have wanted you to have someone. People say that like they knew her." Her jaw tightened. "She was my mother. They don't get to say what she would have wanted." "You're right about that too," Evelyn said. Clara looked up. She had clearly been expecting a defense, and the absence of one left her briefly without the argument she'd prepared. "I'm not trying to replace her," Evelyn said. "I know you know that, somewhere underneath the anger. I'm something different, not the same thing in a different person, something that didn't exist before I got here." She paused. "I love this ranch. I love your brother. I love your father, and She stopped. "I care about you in a way that doesn't have a clean name yet because you haven't let it exist long enough to get one. But it's there." Clara's hands tightened on the box. Her eyes were bright, not yet spilling. "What if you leave?" she said, and her voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, in the way that children's voices crack when they say the thing they've been not saying. "What if you leave too?" she said again, quieter. Evelyn understood then, fully and completely, that this was not about her. This had never been about her. It was about a 12-year-old girl who had watched the most permanent-seeming person in her world disappear, and had understood at a cellular level that permanence was not a promise anyone could make and keep. "I can't promise you nothing will ever happen," Evelyn said. "That would be a lie, and I won't lie to you. What I can tell you is that I have no intention of leaving, ever. And I can tell you that your mother's quilt is still on my bed, and it will stay there because it belongs there, and I mend it when it needs mending because some things are worth taking care of." She held the girl's gaze. "I'm not going anywhere, Clara." The silence that followed was long enough for the wind to speak through the house several times. Clara opened the keepsake box. Inside was a small, folded piece of paper, the kind that looked like it had been opened and reread many times. She took it out and held it, not unfolding it, looking at it. "My mother left letters," she said. "For when we were older. Pa gave me this one last year. She wrote—" Clara's voice was careful now, constructing each word like it might break. "She wrote that she hoped we would let people love us, that she was afraid we'd close up after her." She folded the paper again. "I've been angry at her for writing that, because it felt like she was telling me what to do when she couldn't be here to see if it was right." She put the paper back in the box and closed it. "I'm still angry," she said, "at a lot of things." "That's okay," Evelyn said. "I'm not going to stop being difficult overnight." "I'm not asking you to." Claire looked at her sideways. "I might still be awful sometimes. And I might handle it imperfectly sometimes," Evelyn said. "We'll both have to manage." Something in the girl's face shifted. The particular shift that happened when a fixed position was not abandoned, but quietly, privately, renegotiated. "Fine," Clara said. It was not an embrace, not a declaration. It was Clara's version of a door left open, and Evelyn understood it for what it was. Basset. Thomas, when Silas told him, looked up from his plate with the focused assessment of someone who needed the practical details before he could process the rest. "Does that mean Evelyn's our ma now?" he said. Silas glanced at Evelyn. "It means I'm staying," Evelyn said. "What you call me is up to you." Thomas considered this with the earnest gravity of an 8-year-old confronting a genuinely novel situation. "I might try some different things," he said, "and see what fits." "That seems reasonable," she said. He went back to eating. Then, without looking up, "I'm glad you're staying." A pause. "Also, can we have biscuits tomorrow?" "We can," she said. "Okay." He ate another bite. "Good." March arrived with a particular mix of hope and disappointment that the borderland between winter and spring always carried. A warm day that made you believe, followed by a cold snap that reminded you where you were. The ground began to soften, which meant calving season was coming, which meant the fullest and most demanding stretch of the ranch year was about to begin. Evelyn studied the plan she and Silas had made in January, made 3 adjustments based on what she'd learned in the intervening months, and presented the changes at the kitchen table. He looked at the amended plan, made one question, agreed with the rest. "You should know," he said, "that I've never run a calving season with someone who could also balance the books." "How has it gone when you've done it alone?" "Adequately, sometimes less than that." "Then we'll aim for better than adequate and see what happens," she said, and meant it. What she did not say, though she thought it clearly enough that it might as well have been spoken aloud, was that she was afraid. That the winter had been survivable in part because survival was the only option, and that the approaching season represented something different, a version of this life that was not provisional anymore. She had chosen it. It had chosen her, in its way. And the combination of those two facts was, she was learning, not a comfortable thing so much as a true one. And perhaps that was all truth ever was. She thought sometimes about the woman who had stood on the Dry Creek platform in September, gripping the rail and pressing her coat flat against the wind. That woman had been braced against something she couldn't name. She had not been wrong to brace. She had simply not yet understood that what she was bracing against was not the frontier, not the ranch, not the judgment of a town that had already decided she wouldn't last. She had been bracing against the weight of wanting something real badly enough to risk losing it. She understood that now, and she had stopped bracing. Outside, the March wind moved through the valley the same way it always did, without opinion or preference, carrying the smell of snowmelt and turned earth, and the particular aliveness of a season that had been frozen returning, slowly and without apology, to motion. Evelyn stood on the porch in the early morning with her coffee and listened to it and thought about the calving records she needed to update and the Southfield irrigation plan, and whether the buckboard harness would hold through another hard month or needed replacing now. She thought about Clara in the loft with her mother's letters, about Thomas asking whether biscuits were happening tomorrow, about Silas at the kitchen table with a ledger they were both learning to read together. She went back inside and got to work. Calving season began on a Tuesday in late March and did not stop for 5 weeks. Evelyn had read about it. She had asked Ruth Hadley about it. She had listened to Silas describe it in the careful, understated way he described everything difficult, which she had learned to translate as, "It will be harder than I am telling you." She had believed she was prepared. She had been wrong in the particular way that knowledge and experience are not the same thing until they are. And then you cannot go back to only knowing. The first calf came at 2 in the morning on a night that had forgotten spring was supposed to be arriving. She was the one awake. They had agreed to split the overnight watches rather than destroy both of them equally. And she came out of the barn into the cold to get Silas because the cow was in trouble, the calf presenting wrong, and she knew enough now to know that what she knew was not enough for this. He came out in his boots and coat over his long johns, fully awake the way men who have spent years rising in emergencies are fully awake, not gradually, but all at once. He assessed the situation with his hands and his eyes and the particular knowledge of a man who had done this many times, and he talked to her through what he needed her to do, which was assist rather than direct, and she did it without comment even when the doing of it was not pleasant. And 40 minutes later the calf was on the ground, breathing, and the cow was exhausted but whole. Silas sat back against the barn wall and wiped his hands on a rag that was not remotely adequate for the job. "Good," he said. It was the entirety of his assessment. "Will she feed it?" Evelyn asked. The cow was regarding the calf with the complex expression of a creature that had just survived something. "Give her a few minutes." They gave her a few minutes. The calf was a heifer, small and dark and uncertain on her legs in the tentative way of new things. The cow moved toward her with the instinct that overrode everything else, and Evelyn watched this with the careful attention she'd learned to bring to the ranch's small, non-negotiable facts. "Go back to sleep," Silas said. "I'll watch the rest of the night." "You've got the morning rounds." "So do you." "Then we're the same," she said, "and you can stop trying to manage me." He looked at her sideways in the dim barn lantern light, and there was that quality again. The thing at the corner of his expression that wasn't quite a smile but lived in that neighborhood. "Fine," he said. They sat together against the barn wall in the straw and the cold for another hour, watching the heifer find her legs, and neither of them slept, and neither of them mentioned it. The calving season produced 31 calves in 5 weeks, of which 29 survived. The 2 losses came in the same storm in the second week of April. A late freeze that dropped the temperature 40 degrees in 6 hours and overwhelmed 2 cows that had been weaker going in than they should have been, a fact that Evelyn recorded in the back section of the ledger with the date and the details, and which Silas did not argue about recording even though she could see it cost him something, the way failure always cost him something he didn't show. 31 to 29 is not a bad ratio, Ruth Hadley said, when she came by in May, and reviewed the records with the informed attention of a woman who had run her own ranch for 30 years before her husband died and her son took it over. "The 2 we lost were preventable," Evelyn said. "Next year we need to identify the weaker cows earlier in winter and supplement them differently." Ruth looked at the records. "You've been writing everything down." "Since January." Ruth set the ledger on the table and looked at Evelyn with the expression she wore when something had confirmed something she'd been thinking. "Can I ask you something directly?" "You've never asked permission before," Evelyn said. Ruth almost smiled. "The letters from that Denver company. Has there been another one?" "2," Silas said from across the kitchen, where he had been pretending to be occupied with a harness buckle. He came to the table and sat. "March and late April, both from different names but the same address." "What did you do with them?" "Added them to the record," Evelyn said, "with the dates. Ruth was quiet for a moment. "There's talk in town," she said. "Coal merchant sold his place in April. Took the offer." "I heard," Silas said. "That leaves 6 ranches in this section of the valley that haven't sold. You're one. The Hadley place is another." She paused. "Fletcher thinks someone's been at our east fence, found a section down twice this spring with no good explanation for it." Evelyn looked at Silas. He was looking at the table. "What does Fletcher think happened to it?" she said. "He thinks it didn't come down by itself." The kitchen was quiet for a moment, except for the May wind outside and the distant sound of Thomas doing something in the yard that involved his voice being louder than it needed to be. "I think," Evelyn said carefully, "that we should talk to Judge Parrish again. And I think we should each keep our own records and compare them regularly. If there's a pattern, we'll see it better from 2 sets of data than from 1. Ruth nodded slowly. "Agreed." She stood picking up the ledger and handing it back to Evelyn. "You know, Agnes Whitmore told me last month that you'd changed, said you seemed different than when you came." "Different how?" "More settled, like you've grown into the place." Ruth picked up her hat. Agnes means it as a compliment, which, from Agnes, is something worth noting. After she left, Silas sat for a while at the kitchen table with his coffee. Evelyn refilled it without being asked. "You think it's deliberate, Lisette?" he said. "The fence, the timing of the offers." "I think I don't know yet," she said, "which is why I want it written down. If it is deliberate, if someone's actually interfering with ranches to pressure people into selling, then we're not the only target," she said, "and that means we're not facing it alone." He turned the coffee cup. "You make it sound manageable." "I don't know that it is," she said honestly. "I know that the alternative to managing it is giving up the ranch, and that's not something I'm willing to do." She paused. "Are you?" He looked at her with the quiet directness that she had come to understand was his most fundamental form of communication. "No," he said, "I'm not." "Then we manage it," she said. Summer arrived with the kind of heat that meant business, and the Southfield irrigation project that Evelyn had been planning since January became both more urgent and more complicated when the creek level ran lower than any spring in recent memory. Silas said it was the driest June since before Thomas was born. Evelyn added it to the record and began adjusting the irrigation schedule, moving water to the hay fields in the early morning before the heat took half of it to evaporation. Clara, who had turned 13 in May, with the particular ferocity that 13 tends to bring, had begun to materialize at Evelyn's side on the morning irrigation rounds with the studied casualness of someone who had decided to do a thing but didn't want to make an announcement of it. She didn't ask questions at first. She observed. Then the questions came. Practical ones. The kind that came from someone genuinely trying to understand the logic rather than fill a silence. "Why do you move the water allocation earlier when the heat increases?" she said one morning, walking the East Channel with Evelyn, while the first light came gray and cool over the ridge. "Evaporation rate goes up with heat and sun," Evelyn said. "If we run water at noon in July, we lose almost a third of it before it reaches the far end of the field. Run it at 5 in the morning, and we lose maybe 10%. Clara considered this. "Did you know that when you came here?" "No. I figured it out in February from the water usage records and the hay yield numbers." "From the ledger?" "From the ledger." Clara walked in silence for a moment. She had Margaret's dark hair and her father's careful eyes, and she moved through the world with the attentiveness of someone who had learned early that things could change without warning, so it was better to keep watching. "Could you teach me that?" she said. "The bookkeeping. The records." Evelyn looked at her. "Yes, I'd like that." Clara nodded as if this had been a business discussion, and they had reached a satisfactory conclusion. "Okay, after supper." The after-supper lessons began that week and continued through the summer with the steady rhythm of a practice that had found its natural place in the household schedule. Clara was a quick study, faster than Evelyn at the same age, she suspected, though she didn't say so because Clara would have found the comparison both predictable and unnecessary. The girl had a mind that moved in straight lines when the material was clear and got impatient when it wasn't, which was its own kind of intelligence. Thomas, not to be excluded from anything his sister was involved in, attempted to join the bookkeeping lessons on the second week, lasted 12 minutes, and retreated to his card games with a diplomacy that suggested he understood his own limitations better than he let on. Tech, The incident with Harlan Teague happened in July, and it was the first time that the vague, documented concern about Meridian Land, or Western Frontier Holdings, or whatever name they were using that month, became something with a face on it. Teague rode onto the ranch on a Thursday afternoon without being invited, which in itself was a statement. He was a large man in good clothes that looked wrong on him, the way expensive clothes look wrong on people who aren't accustomed to them, and he had the manner of someone who had been told he was persuasive enough times to believe it. Evelyn was in the kitchen garden when he arrived. She heard the horse on the track, came around the side of the house, and found him already dismounted and looking at the barn with the appraising expression of a man calculating value. "Help you?" she said. He looked at her with the brief, dismissive assessment of a man deciding how much of his attention a woman warranted. "Looking for Silas Rowan. He's in the north pasture. Can I help you with something? I'll wait." He said it like he owned the right to. "You can wait in the yard," she said. "Not on the porch. I don't know you." He looked at her again, recalibrating. "Harlan Teague. I represent some interests in Denver." "I know who you represent," she said pleasantly. "We've received several letters." Something shifted in his expression. "Then you know we're offering a very fair price for this property." "We know what the letters say," she said. "You can wait in the yard. There's a water trough by the barn if your horse needs it." She went back to the garden and did not watch him from the window, which took more self-discipline than she expected. Silas came back from the north pasture 40 minutes later. She heard their voices from inside the house, not the words, the register, and went about what she was doing without interrupting. Silas's voice had a low, flat quality when he was containing something. She recognized it. Teague rode out 20 minutes after that. Silas came in and stood in the kitchen doorway with the look of a man reviewing a conversation he wanted to have said differently. "What did he offer?" she asked. 400 more than the letters. He called it a final offer. "It's not a final offer," she said. "If it were final, he wouldn't have ridden 7 miles in July heat to make it." "No," Silas agreed. "He also said something that I want you to hear." He came and sat at the table. He said the Valley Water situation was going to get more complicated in the next few years. He said it like he was being helpful. Evelyn stopped what she was doing. He said was going to get. That's what he said. She sat down across from him. "He's not predicting. He's telling us what they're planning to do." "That's what I thought too." She pulled the ledger out of the drawer. "I'm writing it down. The date, what he said, exactly how he said it." She looked up. "We need to talk to Judge Parrish again. And I think we need to talk to the other ranchers who haven't sold. The Hadleys, the Garveys, the Nortons. If someone is planning to interfere with water access, they can't do it to one ranch at a time. They'd need to do it to the source. And that's something that affects everyone in the valley." Silas watched her working through it. He had the expression he wore when he was letting something run its course before he responded. "You should have been a lawyer," he said. "I should have been a lot of things," she said. "Right now I'm a rancher. Write down what you remember about the exact words Teague used. Don't wait until tomorrow." He took the pen she offered and wrote. His handwriting was plain and careful, the handwriting of a man who wrote because it was necessary, not because he enjoyed it. She read it when he finished, asked 2 clarifying questions, and added her own notes below his. "We'll go to town tomorrow," she said. "Judge Parrish first, then the Hadleys. And if the judge thinks there's nothing to be done, then we keep recording," she said. "The people who are trying to take this valley are betting that individual ranchers won't coordinate, that each person will look at their own situation and decide it's not worth the fight. If we're all writing things down separately and we put those records together, it stops being one person's complaint and becomes something that looks like what it is." Silas was quiet for a moment. "You're not afraid of them." She considered this honestly. "I'm afraid of losing this ranch," she said. "I'm significantly more afraid of that than I am of them, which I think is the correct order of priorities." The meeting at Judge Parrish's house happened on a Saturday in late July and involved more people than Evelyn had expected. Ruth Hadley came with Fletcher. Dale Garvey came alone, a lean, weathered man in his 60s who had the quality of someone who had outlasted a number of things he hadn't expected to outlast. Margaret Norton sent her son Hector, who was 23 and uncomfortable in the presence of anyone over 50, but who had brought a folder of his own documents that turned out to be the most comprehensive records anyone had. Evelyn spread her ledger on the judge's dining room table, and Hector Norton spread his folder next to it. And for 2 hours they compared information that, taken separately, could each be explained as ordinary frontier misfortune. Fence sections down without adequate cause, an unusually difficult calving season, a summer creek level that a land agent from Denver apparently had information about before it occurred. Judge Parrish listened with his hands folded and his face entirely still. When they had finished, he said, "What you have here is not proof of anything a court would currently act on. What you have is a pattern that a court might act on in 6 months, if it continues and you continue documenting it." 6 months, Dale Garvey said. "If you can hold the ranches for 6 months and keep recording, yes. The water access question, if there is a legitimate legal challenge to be made, needs to go through the Territorial Water Rights Office in Cheyenne, and that requires documentation and a formal complaint." "And in the meantime," Ruth said, "in the meantime, you hold. You share information with each other, and you do not sell." He looked around the table. "Not because I am telling you the value of your land, but because a coordinated refusal is more difficult to manage than individual decisions, and the people making these offers know that." On the drive home, Silas was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was turning something over. 6 months, he said eventually. "It might be less," Evelyn said. "If Hector Norton's records on the water diversion are as clear as they look, the complaint could be filed in September. And if it's more, then it's more," she said. "We're not worse positioned in December than we are now. We've survived a winter before." He glanced at her. "You keep saying we." "Because it keeps being accurate." He returned his eyes to the road. "It does," he said. August was the kind of month that tested the premise of staying. The heat did not relent. The hay yield was lower than the adjusted plan had accounted for. And one of the senior hands, a man named Cade, who had worked the ranch since before Margaret died, left for a mining opportunity in Colorado with 2 weeks' notice, and a guilt that expressed itself as excessive helpfulness on the way out the door. The loss of Cade meant Evelyn and Silas absorbed his work between them, which was not nothing. It meant earlier mornings, later nights, and the particular exhaustion that comes from filling a gap that two people are splitting between them while also doing everything they were already doing. Thomas, who at 9 had grown into a boy with genuine usefulness and a strong preference for being included, took on water duties and small repairs with a seriousness that made both adults notice and not remark on, because remarking would have embarrassed him. Clara took on the hay records entirely, updating them daily in the ledger with the precision of someone who had found, in the management of information, a form of control over a world that had previously seemed to operate without reference to her preferences. She was meticulous. She was sometimes faster than Evelyn at calculation. She began, in late August, to offer observations without being asked, not pushingly, not in the manner of a child performing competence, but in the flat, factual way of someone who had looked at the numbers and reached a conclusion. "We need to buy additional hay before October," she said at supper one evening. "If the Southfield comes in at the current rate and we have the same herd through winter, we're short by approximately 2 weeks' worth." Silas looked at her. "I've been running it," Clara said. "The numbers. I can show you." "Show me after supper," Evelyn said. After supper, Clara spread the figures on the table with the careful arrangement of someone who had rehearsed the presentation. It was, as she had said, accurate. They were short. The margin was not catastrophic, but it was real. "Good catch," Evelyn said. Clara accepted this without performance. "When should we buy?" "September prices will be better than October," Silas said. "I'll go to the Calloway place. The new owners sold off part of the hay crop last year. They might again." "I can write the inquiry," Evelyn said. "Clara, do you want to draft it?" Clara looked up from the figures. "I've never written a business letter." "Then this is the first one," Evelyn said, and put a blank piece of paper in front of her. The letter Clara wrote was somewhat formal and somewhat stiff in the way of first letters, and Evelyn suggested 2 changes and left the rest untouched, and Silas read it and said it would do the job, which from him was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Clara folded it and addressed it, and did not say anything, but she walked differently for the rest of the evening, which was its own kind of statement. The formal water rights complaint was filed in Cheyenne in the 3rd week of September by Judge Parrish on behalf of 5 valley ranches, With documentation contributed by all of them and organized, the judge privately acknowledged to Ruth Hadley, primarily by a woman who had arrived in Dry Creek 1 year earlier with a single bag and no history in the territory. 2 weeks after the filing, a second representative from Denver, not Teague this time, someone more cautious and more lawyerly, appeared in town and met with the judge, and then drove out to the Rowan Ranch on a Tuesday afternoon with a revised offer. Evelyn met him at the door. Silas stood beside her. The man's name was Dorrance, and he was smoother than Teague and understood better that the persuasion had to be customized to the audience. He offered a price that was, by any reasonable measure, a good price. He offered relocation assistance. He offered what he called a settlement on any water rights disputes, which was the first time anyone from his company had acknowledged the dispute existed. "No," Evelyn said. She said it before he had fully finished the sentence. Dorrance looked at Silas. "She speaks for this ranch," Silas said, "same as I do." Dorrance reassessed. He spent 5 more minutes trying variations on his argument and finding that the variations didn't change the answer. He left with the particular air of a man who would be writing a report that his employers would not enjoy reading. After his wagon was off the property, Silas turned to Evelyn on the porch. "You said no before he finished talking," he said. "I knew what he was going to say. Still, was I wrong?" He looked at the empty road where Dorrance's wagon had been. "No," he said. "You were not wrong." She went back inside. He followed. In the kitchen, Thomas was attempting to make biscuits from a recipe he had partly invented, and the results were promising in some ways and experimental in others. Claire was at the table with the ledger updating the hay records. It was, Evelyn thought, standing in the doorway of a kitchen in Wyoming on a September afternoon, 1 year and a handful of days since she'd stepped off a train with everything she owned in a single bag. It was a particular kind of ordinary. The flour dust and the pencil scratch and the smell of the wood stove and the sound of the wind outside. The specific shapes of these 3 people in this room. The work that was waiting tomorrow and the day after that. The kind of work that never ran out. That was not about getting somewhere else, but about being fully in the place you already were. She was not a romantic. She did not think in those terms. But she was honest. And the honest thing was this. A year ago, she had arrived here prepared for difficulty and prepared to be wrong and prepared, if necessary, to survive on practically nothing. She had not been prepared for this, for the specific weight and texture of belonging somewhere, for the way it settled into your body, not like an arrival, but like a recognition, like returning to a place you hadn't known you'd left. Outside, the early September sky was beginning to shift toward its evening colors, and somewhere in the north pasture, Biscuit was barking at something that probably didn't warrant the attention he was giving it, and Thomas said something about his biscuits that made Clara snort and tell him they looked like river rocks. Evelyn went to the stove to check the heat, and the evening began, the same as evenings did, imperfect and complete and entirely, irreversibly hers. The territorial water rights ruling came back from Cheyenne on a Wednesday in November, 14 months after Evelyn had first stepped off the train in Dry Creek. Judge Parrish rode out himself to deliver it, which told her something before he'd said a word. A man who sent bad news sent a letter. A man who came himself was carrying something worth the ride. She was in the kitchen garden, pulling the last of the root vegetables before the ground froze when she heard his horse on the track. She straightened up with her hands still dirty and watched him dismount with the deliberate care of a 71-year-old man who had learned not to hurry the things that couldn't be hurried. And when he looked at her across the yard, his expression was not a smile exactly. It was something more restrained than that. The expression of a man who had seen enough outcomes to know that satisfaction was a thing you held carefully. "Is Silas here?" he said. "North fence, I can get him." "Get him," the judge said. "And get the girl with the ledger. I want her to hear this too." She found Silas at the fence line and told him, and the way he dropped what he was doing and came without asking questions told her something about how much of himself he'd been carrying in the waiting. Clara was easier to find. She was in the barn with the hay records, as she often was on afternoons when the light was good, a habit she'd developed in August and maintained with the consistency of someone who understood that numbers were a form of order in a world that was not always orderly. They gathered in the kitchen around the table where so many things had been decided, and Judge Parrish put on his reading glasses and spread 2 documents on the wood. "The Territorial Water Rights Commission," he said, "has issued a formal finding. Meridian Land Company. which is what Western Frontier Holdings is properly called, as our records established, has been found to have filed fraudulent secondary water claims on 3 tributaries of the East Creek in this valley. The claims were filed under false names beginning approximately 4 years ago. He paused and looked at them over his glasses. The claims are vacated. Your original filings stand. All 5 ranches. The kitchen was very quiet. Fraudulent, Silas said. They'll contest it. They will try, the judge said. They have 30 days to file a response in Cheyenne. However, he tapped the second document. The Attorney General's office in Denver has opened a separate inquiry into Meridian's business practices in 3 territories. The fraudulent water claims are part of a larger pattern they've been building a case around for 2 years. He set down his glasses. They are not going to win this. The question is how long it takes them to understand that. And in the meantime, Evelyn said, in the meantime, your water rights are restored and protected under the original filing. If anyone interferes with your water access, physically or legally, you have standing to take immediate action. He looked at Clara, who had been sitting very still with her hands flat on the table. Young lady, your records were the clearest and most complete of anything I submitted. The commissioner's office specifically noted the quality of documentation from this ranch. Clara looked at the table. A muscle moved in her jaw in the way that happened when she was processing something she didn't know how to receive yet. That was Evelyn's system, she said. It was your execution of it, Evelyn said. That's not a small thing. Clara said nothing, but she straightened slightly in her chair, the almost imperceptible shift of someone absorbing something that mattered. After the judge left, the 3 of them stood in the kitchen in the particular silence that follows resolved tension. Not celebratory, not euphoric, but something quieter and more durable. Relief that had lived so long as worry that it had forgotten how to present itself as anything else. Thomas, who had been in the yard and came inside to find 3 people standing around the kitchen table looking like a painting he didn't understand, looked from face to face and said, "Did something happen?" "We won something," Evelyn said. He considered this. "Is that why nobody's talking?" "We're still catching up to it," she said. He nodded as if this made complete sense and went to get himself a biscuit from the pan on the stove, because Thomas had learned, in the way that younger children in working households learn, that the appropriate response to most large adult situations was to continue doing ordinary things and let the largeness sort itself out. The wedding was in December, which was not, as Ruth Hadley pointed out, the most practical time for a ceremony in Wyoming. Spring would be sensible, Ruth said. You could have it outside. People could come without risking their lives in the snow. I know it would be more sensible in spring, Evelyn said. We're not waiting for spring. Ruth looked at her with the expression she reserved for decisions she disagreed with, but had decided to support. All right, she said, then I'll make the cake. The ceremony was small, which was what both of them wanted. Not from modesty, but from a shared preference for things that were real over things that were performed. Judge Parrish, who had become over the past year something that was not quite a friend and not quite a colleague, but occupied the particular space between those things, agreed to officiate. Ruth and Fletcher Hadley came, Dale Garvey and his wife. Hector Norton with his new wife, whom he'd married in October. A handful of others who had, over the past 14 months, shifted their assessment of Evelyn Mercer from outsider who won't last to something that required a more complicated word. The church had been offered and declined. They held it in the Rowan House, which was the place that had made all of it real, and the rooms were small for the number of people in them, and the fire was too hot, and someone knocked over a cup of cider on the hallway floor, and Thomas stood next to his father in his good shirt with his hair combed in a way that suggested Clara's involvement, and Clara stood beside Evelyn in a dark green dress she had made herself with a skill that astonished everyone, including Evelyn, who had not known she was making it. When the judge asked if there were words either of them wanted to say, Silas said what he had prepared, which was short and plain and precise in exactly the way he was. I want to say, in front of everyone here, that this woman came to this place when she had no reason to trust it, and she stayed when she had every reason to leave, and she has made everything I built worth having. That's all I want to say. Evelyn had not prepared words. She had thought she would, and then she had found, in the days before, that what she wanted to say didn't arrange itself into a speech, but into something simpler. "I came here with one bag," she said. "I thought the best I could hope for was a tolerable arrangement and enough work to keep from thinking too much about my life. I was wrong about what was possible." I want to say that clearly, because I think most people are wrong about what's possible. And it seems worth saying out loud when you find out you were. Someone in the back of the room made a sound that might have been Ruth Hadley preventing herself from crying, which would have been so entirely unlike Ruth that Evelyn chose not to investigate it. Afterwards, standing at the edge of the room with a cup of something warm that Fletcher had produced from his coat with the matter-of-fact magic of a man who always knew what a room needed, she caught Clara watching her from across the gathering. The girl looked away immediately, with the precision of someone who had been caught doing something she hadn't decided to commit to yet. Then, after a moment, she looked back. Held the look this time. She lifted her cup, a small gesture, almost imperceptible. Evelyn lifted hers. That was all. It was enough. What the years after taught her was this: belonging is not a thing that happens to you. It is a thing you make, over and over, in the ordinary, unremarkable days that do not feel like they matter while they are happening and which turn out to be everything. She understood this not as a revelation, but as an accumulation, the way understanding tends to arrive, not in lightning, but in the slow addition of one real day on top of another until the pile of them is high enough to see from. The second winter as Silas's wife was harder than the first in some ways, and easier in others. Harder because they had more to protect now. The water rights established, the herd improved, the Southfield irrigation running, and therefore more to lose. Easier because the weight of it was distributed differently. She was not a provisional presence anymore, making herself useful so she could justify staying. She was a rancher, and this was her ranch. And the work was not the work of proving anything. It was just the work. Thomas turned 10 in February and grew 2 inches in a single season, which seemed improbable but was recorded in pencil on the doorframe of the kitchen where Clara had started keeping marks the previous spring. He became, in that year, a child who was genuinely useful in ways that went beyond willingness. He had an intuition with the horses that Silas recognized and began deliberately cultivating, taking him out on morning rounds with a patience he did not always have for other things. Evelyn watched this from a careful distance, knowing that what was happening between them in those early morning rides was not something that needed an audience. Clara, at 14, was a person who occupied a room differently than she had at 12. The anger had not disappeared. It had transformed, in the way that strong feelings transform when they are given enough time and enough honest attention, into something more specific and therefore more manageable. She was still direct to the point of bluntness. She still had her mother's precision and her father's stubbornness, and a mind that moved faster than most people around her could follow. She had also, in the way of young people who grow up in households where women do real work and are seen doing it, developed a fundamental expectation of her own competence that was not arrogance, but its natural predecessor. In March of that second year, she came to Evelyn with a question that had clearly been sitting in preparation for some time. "Do women go to school?" she said. "Real school, after the local schoolhouse." "Some do," Evelyn said. "There are colleges that accept women. Not many, and not everywhere, but some." "In Wyoming?" "Not yet, that I know of. In the East, yes. Some in the Midwest." Clara was quiet for a moment, looking at the kitchen table. "How does a person find out which ones?" "I can write some letters," Evelyn said. "If you want to know, that's a reasonable place to start." "I want to know," Clara said. "I'm not saying I'm going. I want to know what's possible." Evelyn thought about the words she had said at her own wedding, standing in this same room to these same people. Most people are wrong about what's possible. She had meant it then. She meant it more now. "I'll write the letters this week," she said. Clara nodded. She picked up the ledger from the corner of the table. She had stopped asking if it was all right to take it, and simply taken it, which was its own kind of progress, and went to work on the spring planting records. Evelyn watched her for a moment and felt something move through her that she didn't have a clean name for. Pride was part of it, but it was bigger than pride. It was something like witnessing, the specific feeling of seeing a person arrive at themselves. The last letter from Meridian Land Company came in April of that second year. It was not from Dorrance or from Teague. It was from a lawyer in Denver who identified himself as managing the liquidation of Western Frontier Holdings, and it informed them that the company had ceased operations following the conclusion of the Attorney General's inquiry and that all outstanding land offers were hereby withdrawn. Evelyn read it at the kitchen table and then put it in the ledger in the back section with all the others. Not as a victory declaration, as a fact documented in the place where facts were kept, alongside the dates and the fence incidents and the water readings and the calving records and Clara's hay calculations from August, the long, unglamorous paper trail of a family that had refused to be managed out of its own land. She showed it to Silas that evening. He read it, put it down. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "You know what would have happened if I'd sold, after the second letter, before you came?" "You didn't sell," she said. "I was thinking about it," he said. "I want to be honest about that. The second winter after Margaret, the calving losses, the dry summer, I was thinking about it." She looked at him. This was not something he said easily, and she received it with the care it deserved. "I know what it is to look at a situation and think the fight isn't worth what it costs," she said. "I left Pennsylvania. I left Chicago. I know how it feels to calculate that you're better off letting go." She picked up her coffee. "But we didn't let go." "You didn't let go," he said. "There's a difference." "Not anymore," she said, and meant it in every sense. He put his hand over hers on the table, not a gesture from a man who made many gestures, which was exactly why it landed the way it did. The spring of that second year brought the best calving season the ranch had recorded, 37 calves, 35 surviving. The Southfield irrigation, adjusted now through 2 seasons of observation and correction, produced a hay yield that covered their winter needs with enough margin to sell a portion to Dale Garvey, who'd had a rough cutting season. The buckboard harness that had needed replacing in March finally got replaced, and Silas did it without being reminded, which Evelyn chose not to mention because the mention would have cost more than the lesson was worth. Small victories, the kind that nobody outside the ranch would write down, and that everybody inside it felt in their bodies. In the particular quality of an evening where the work was done, and the animals were in, and the accounts were level, and the 4 of them sat around the kitchen table playing cards with the lamp burning, and the Wyoming night outside doing its enormous, indifferent best. She thought sometimes about the women she had known in Chicago, women at the boarding house, women from the dry goods merchant circle, women who had asked her, when she told them she was going to Wyoming to marry a rancher she'd never met, whether she was entirely well. She thought about what she would say to them now, if she could. Not to prove anything. Just because honesty had become such a fundamental part of how she moved through the world that she couldn't imagine encountering the question without answering it truthfully. She would say, "I was not sure it was going to work. I was not sure I was capable of it. I was not sure the man would be kind, or the land survivable, or the children willing to let me near them. I was not sure of any of it, and I went anyway, not because I was brave, but because I understood, at 31 years old, that the certainty I was waiting for was never going to arrive, and that waiting for it was its own kind of decision. The decision to let life be managed by fear rather than by choice." She would say, "The frontier does not care about your plans. It does not care about your feelings or your expectations or the story you told yourself on the train about how it was going to go. It will show you exactly what you are made of, and not gently." And what I found out I was made of turned out to be more than I'd given myself credit for, and less than I'd needed to be. And I made up the difference by learning, badly at first, and then less badly, one day at a time. She would say, "Belonging is not a place you arrive at. It is a practice. You do it every day, imperfectly, and eventually the imperfect days pile up into something that looks, from the outside, like it was always there." She did not say these things to anyone, because there was no one to say them to, and because the living of them seemed more important than the articulation. But she thought them on evenings when the light came through the kitchen window at the particular angle that turned everything amber and warm, and the thought had the comfortable texture of something true. 3 years after the day she'd stepped off the train in Dry Creek, Evelyn Rowan, she had taken the name without ceremony, simply because it fit, stood on the porch in the early morning of a September day that was almost the anniversary of her arrival, and looked at the ranch the way she sometimes did when she allowed herself to see it whole. The barn roof was solid, repaired twice now, and done right the second time with better materials and an extra pair of hands that hadn't been available the first time. The fence lines were clean and maintained on a schedule that Clara had put in the household calendar 2 winters ago, and that Thomas, who had grown into a lanky 12-year-old with his father's economy of movement, now checked on Tuesdays without being asked. The south field was laid out differently than it had been 3 years ago. She and Silas had reconfigured the irrigation channels the previous spring based on 3 years of water data, and the difference was visible even from the porch in the quality and evenness of what grew there. The ledger on the kitchen table, the third one now, the first two filled and stored in the desk drawer, documented a ranch that was not just surviving, it was producing. Not abundantly, not in the way of places that had better weather or more water or fewer years of difficult history, but solidly, honestly. In the way of something that had been built to last rather than to impress. Biscuit, who was 11 and grayer than ever and moved with the dignified caution of a dog who had stopped pretending that youth was an option, came and stood beside her on the porch with the patient presence he'd always had. She scratched behind his ear without looking down. Silas came out with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one and stood beside her and looked at the same morning she was looking at. This was something they did. Not always, not ritually, but often enough that it had become its own kind of communication, the standing together in the early quiet before the day demanded things of them. Clara's letter came back, he said. I know, I saw it on the table. She drank her coffee. She's been accepted. I know. The letter was from a women's college in Ohio. One of 3 she'd applied to at Evelyn's encouragement through the winter months when the ledger work was slower and there was time to sit with possibility. Clara was 15, and Ohio was a long way from Wyoming, and none of them had fully worked out what they thought about it yet. She wants to go, Evelyn said. She hasn't said so directly, but she wants to. I know that too. What do you think? He was quiet for a long time, his version of an answer in progress, which she had learned to recognize and wait for. I think, he said finally, that I did not raise her to stay small just because staying small is safer. He drank his coffee. I think her mother would have put her on the train herself. Evelyn looked out at the ridge where the morning light was arriving in its own unhurried way. She might come back, she said. People sometimes come back. And if she doesn't, then she builds something else, somewhere else. And we know that whatever it is, she built it the right way. She paused. We know that because we watched her learn how. He was quiet again, then, You're going to cry when she leaves. I'm definitely not going to cry when she leaves, Evelyn said. All right, he said, in the tone that meant he believed none of it. She would cry. She already knew this. She would cry in the barn where no one could see her, and then she would come back inside and start supper. And that would be that. Clara left for Ohio in August, 4 years to the month after Evelyn had arrived in Dry Creek. The send-off at the train station was not what anyone would call composed. Thomas, who had developed in the past year a determined commitment to not appearing sentimental, stood very straight on the platform and hugged his sister quickly, and then walked back to stand with his father with the specific dignity of a boy who was going to cry the moment the train was out of sight, and knew it. Silas said something to Clara on the platform that Evelyn didn't hear. It was private, and she was glad for that. Some things needed no witnesses. Clara listened with her whole face still and then pressed her forehead briefly against her father's chest, which was the most unguarded gesture Evelyn had seen from her in 4 years. Then Clara came to Evelyn. She was taller now, almost Evelyn's height, with the self-contained quality of a young woman who had grown into herself. She looked at Evelyn with those dark, careful eyes. I'm going to write, she said. Real letters, not short ones. I'll expect them, Evelyn said. And when I come back at Christmas, we'll have everything how you like it, Evelyn said. Clara looked at her. There was something moving in her face that she was managing carefully, the way she managed most things. You know, she said, when you came, I thought the worst thing that could happen was that you'd stay. I know, Evelyn said. I was wrong. They stood for a moment in the noise and the dust of the train platform, and then Clara put her arms around her, and Evelyn held on, and the train bell rang. She cried in the barn. It took about 40 minutes. What Evelyn understood, by the time the years had settled into themselves, and the ranch had become the kind of operation that other valley ranchers sometimes came to look at and ask questions about. Not because it was the biggest or the most profitable, but because it had a quality of durability that people could recognize without being able to fully name. What she understood was this: the frontier does not give you a home. It gives you raw material and difficulty and weather and distance and long silences. And what you do with those things is entirely up to you. She had come to Wyoming with one bag and a provisional arrangement, and the unspoken private conviction that the best she could manage was a life that was tolerable. That was the assumption she'd arrived with, that she was the kind of person things happened to, and the most she could do was handle them well. It had taken a barn roof and a cattle drive and a sand wash and a letter from a Denver land company and a 12-year-old girl's grief and a man who said what he meant and a February night in a cold kitchen when she had finally understood that what she'd been calling caution was just fear wearing sensible clothes. It had taken all of that to dismantle the assumption. She was not a person who things happened to. She was a person who happened to things. She had always been that person. She had simply never been in a place that required it of her clearly enough. The frontier required it of everyone, which was both its cruelty and its particular gift. She thought about other women who had made the same trip she had made. Other letters, other trains, other arrivals on platforms, in isolated towns where the community had already decided the verdict. Some of them had left. She had met a few of them in those first years at the occasional social gatherings, where the women of the valley compared notes with the directness of people who could not afford the luxury of pretending things were fine when they weren't. Some of them had left, and she did not judge them for it. The leaving was not failure. Sometimes it was clarity. Sometimes you arrive at a place and understand in your body that it is not the right material for the life you need to build. That was not weakness. That was honesty. What she had understood, standing on the Dry Creek platform, with her hair coming out of its pins and the Wyoming wind making its opinions known, was that this was the right material. Not because it was easy or beautiful or welcoming, because it was real and demanding, and it would show her exactly what she was worth in a language she did not yet speak, but had the capacity to learn. She had been right about that. She had not been right about much else, but she had been right about that. Thomas was 17 when he told Silas he wanted to run the East Range independently, to take the smaller herd and manage that section of the ranch as his own responsibility, keeping his own records, making his own decisions, accountable for the outcomes. Silas brought it to Evelyn the same evening. "He's 17, Silas said. It was not a complete sentence. It contained several other sentences inside it. "He's been doing the morning rounds for 4 years without being told," she said. "He's been tracking the East herd's condition in his own notebook since he was 15. He gave you a 3-page analysis of the grazing rotation last spring that you used." She picked up her coffee. "He's been running it in everything but name." Silas sat with that. "If he makes a mistake out there, he'll make mistakes," she said. "We all make mistakes. The difference is whether the person making them knows enough to recognize them and correct them, and whether they've had enough practice to not be destroyed by them." She paused. "He has. We made sure of that." "We." The word so natural now that neither of them noticed it. Silas gave Thomas the East Range in October. The first season had 2 significant errors and one decision that Silas privately thought was better than what he himself would have done. He told Thomas about all 3. Thomas wrote them in his notebook. The ranch grew into itself year by year, the way things grow that are planted in the right ground and given enough time and enough water and enough honest attention. Not fast, not without difficulty. With the particular unspectacular solidity of things that are built for the long run by people who understand that the long run is the point. Clara came back as it happened. Not permanently, not to the ranch, but to Wyoming, to a teaching position in Cheyenne that she wrote to tell them about in a letter that was, as promised, not short. She came home at Christmas and sometimes in the summers, and she moved through the ranch in those visits with the recognizing attention of someone returning to the place where they had learned the most important things about themselves. Not the curriculum things, not the Ohio things, but the earlier and more fundamental knowledge that work done honestly means something, that numbers tell the truth when people won't, that showing up when it would be easier not to is the whole of integrity, that love is mostly a verb, She told Evelyn this once, on an August afternoon when they were sitting on the porch with their coffee and the valley was gold in the late summer heat. "I used to think you came here because you had to," Clara said. "Because you had nowhere else." "I came here because I chose it," Evelyn said. "The other options existed. They just weren't this." "What was it for you? The thing that made it this and not something else?" Evelyn thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about it. "I looked at the plane when the wagon was coming out from town that first day," she said, "and it was enormous and empty and nothing about it was welcoming. And I thought, this is a place that will ask everything of you and explain nothing and help you with none of it. And something in me," she stopped, found the word. "Something in me was relieved because I was tired of places that softened everything. I wanted something real." Clara was quiet for a moment, looking at the ridge. "She would have liked you," she said. It was almost exactly what she'd said 6 years earlier, sitting on the edge of the bed with her mother's quilt. But the words were older now, and the way she said them was different. Not as a wound being examined, but as something that had healed into a fact she was comfortable with. "I know," Evelyn said, and for the first time she believed it completely. The afternoon moved through its hours the way Wyoming afternoons moved, slowly and with the particular quality of light that turned everything honest, that showed you the land exactly as it was without flattery or apology. Biscuit had died the previous winter, and the dog that had replaced him, a younger, more excitable animal that Thomas had named Biscuit too, with the pragmatic sentimentality of a 17-year-old, was currently demonstrating his excitability in the yard in a way that involved a great deal of running and no clear objective. Inside, Silas was doing something at the kitchen table that involved a harness and a level of concentration that suggested the harness had been annoying him for some time. Thomas was in the East Range. The ledger was on the corner of the table, the fourth one now, filling slowly with the accumulating record of a life that had turned out to be more than anyone had expected it to be, including the woman who was living it. Evelyn set down her coffee cup and looked at the valley. The full sweep of it, the ridgeline and the creek and the south field green with late-season growth and the fence lines running straight and clean to the horizon. The sky above it was the enormous Wyoming sky, unchanged and indifferent and extraordinary, the same sky that had pressed down on a train platform 6 years ago, while a woman with one bag and no certainty had gripped an iron rail and put her feet on the ground. She was not that woman anymore. Not because she had become someone better, she had made too many mistakes in the years between to claim any clean transformation, but because she had accumulated, because she had been changed by real things in real time, in the way that only actual experience can change a person. And the change had weight and texture and a specific smell, like turned earth in the south field, like leather and lantern oil in the barn, like coffee in the kitchen on a winter morning when the frost was on the window and the fire was coming up, and the four of them were each doing what they did, imperfectly and entirely, in the life they had made. She had come here with one bag. She had everything now. Not in the way of abundance or comfort or security. The frontier made no permanent promises about any of those things, and she had stopped asking it to. But in the way of fullness, in the way of a life that was entirely, irrevocably hers, built from the ground up by her own hands, in partnership with people she had chosen and who had chosen her back, in this vast and difficult and magnificent place that had asked everything of her and given her, in return, the one thing she had not known she needed until she had it, the knowledge of what she was worth. Not what others decided she was worth, not what circumstance had assigned her, but what she herself had discovered, one hard day at a time, in the work and the cold and the long Wyoming nights, and the morning light coming over the ridge onto a ranch that was hers in every sense that mattered. That was the home she had found, not the house, not the land, the knowledge. And standing on the porch in the September afternoon with her daughter beside her, and her husband at the kitchen table, and the valley spread out in front of her in all its enormous, unforgiving, irreplaceable realness, Evelyn Rowan understood that she would never need to look for it again.
Knitted sleeve of some sort. That's the goal, at least. Or like maybe to snap on to protect the rim of the earphones. When the guys want to learn to crochet, I don't know if I'll be able to teach them, but I'll try. Exactly. Trying is all you can do, Sajorana. That's awesome. I love that they're interested in learning how to crochet. That's fucking amazing. Them showing interest in something new is such a good sign that you're doing a great job, you know? I love a dark comedy movie like Death to Smoochie is one of my favorite movies. Oh, okay. All right. I'll have to check it out. Yeah, what I will say is, like, for example, I'm really into